Welcome to Tocqueville Talks. I'm your co-host, Beth, the communications director here at the Tocqueville Center, and my usual co-host, Brent Nelson, the director of the Tocqueville Center, is off for May X in Europe. So today I'm going to be here discussing the namesake of our center, Alexis de Tocqueville, with Rob Larrivee, who's an assistant professor here at Furman University in political science. And he has taught on Tocqueville for quite some time, and he has also been a member of the Tocqueville Center community for quite some time, participating in events. And he also happens to be my husband. So this is a first. He's been on the podcast before, but this is a first where we're just going to be speaking with each other and talking about our experiences in reading and teaching Tocqueville. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about who Tocqueville was, and then we're going to get into our we have different experiences in encountering Tocqueville and learning about Tocqueville, and we also have different experiences teaching Tocqueville. So before we get into that, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on who Tocqueville was. He was a French aristocrat and a political thinker. He was born in 1805, and his family narrowly survived the Terror. His grandparents, in fact, were beheaded in 1794, and his parents survived only because Robespierre happened to fall before their execution. And that experience of radical upheaval never left him, and I think I can see how it shapes, if not a lot or everything that he wrote, much of what he wrote. And so he goes off in 1831. He was still pretty young, and he goes off to America. Officially, the trip was commissioned to study the American penitentiary system. But really, what he wanted to see was democracy functioning, because he wanted to understand the future of Europe. So he travels for 9 months through America, 7,000 miles, over 200 interviews, all through New York, New England, the frontier, the South. And one intriguing detail from Olivier Zundt's biography, The Man Who Understood Democracy, and we had Olivier here a couple years ago for the Tocqueville Center, and that was a great visit, is that after the Revolution of 1830, Tocqueville's political position was precarious. With the old regime gone, his career was blocked under Louis Philippe. And he and his colleague, Gustave de Beaumont, proposed the prison trip study themselves, and the Interior Ministry approved it, and he engineered his own commission. The point being that the man who would spend his entire career warning about bureaucratic centralization used bureaucratic maneuvering amidst a centralized bureaucracy to fund his own trip, and there's something kind of poetic about that. I'll start first talking about how I encountered de Tocqueville. I'm from Canada, as is Rob. I had never really read Tocqueville until graduate school. I took this class with Michael Zuckert, who's a political theorist at the University of Notre Dame, and we read through Democracy in America. And we spent the entire semester doing this. It was one of the most memorable experiences, I would say, that I had at Notre Dame, because I just had never really explored America as Tocqueville does it. And what does that mean? It means studying it not just as a historian or a sociologist or a political scientist, but somebody who has that capacity to look at these many details and synthesize or induce generalizations that are not empty or abstract concepts, but truly illuminating of the phenomena. So that's what I really remember. And I remember one of those phenomena that Michael Zuckert really emphasized in his teaching of de Tocqueville was this concept that Tocqueville has of the social state. A lot of political theorists, if they're looking at a political community, they begin with individuals, institutions, or rights or something like that. And Tocqueville instead begins with this concept of the social state, which is this kind of texture or a background of equality that precedes and conditions everything else. And it's not just a political fact. It shapes ideas, sentiments, habits, and imagination. So it's in a way almost sociological before that really existed as a discipline. But the idea being that the social state of equality precedes the political state of equality. And that framing kind of stayed with me. Going through and then being able to teach Tocqueville as I left graduate school, left Notre Dame, went on to different positions teaching in different places, I was mainly teaching Tocqueville at the freshman level for intro government classes. So it was interesting to watch the students' reactions to reading Tocqueville. One of the parts of Tocqueville that I really have enjoyed reading with students connects to a TV show that I don't know how popular it still is. It's still pretty familiar, but back when I started teaching this, it was quite well known, and it's called The Gilmore Girls. And it's set in a tiny Connecticut town called Stars Hollow, and it really resembles the New England townships that Tocqueville describes in Democracy in America. What he found in these New England townships is a society where laws and mores and habits of hearts move together. Ideas and sentiments were in harmony. He saw the township as being where American liberty really lives, where citizens learn to govern themselves before they govern anything larger. So that idea that local self-governance isn't just a matter of efficiency or it's convenient to do things this way. It actually forms citizens in the habits and mores of self-government, and it's where the democratic character, that social state of equality, it's partly like the factory where that is made. And Stars Hollow, in this show, The Gilmore Girls, is really funny because the townspeople are very involved in their local meeting, and they get in arguments over seemingly ridiculous things like, where to move the gazebo in the village green, or how to fund a bridge that needs repair. All these things people get into huge, very petty fights over, but it's really interesting to see how Tocqueville observes that in America, specifically how he contrasts that with France. When he goes to describe France, he uses these two concepts to make sense of what is going on in America and how that's different from what's going on in France. And those two concepts are governmental power and administrative power. Governmental power is something that can be centralized and is centralized in America. It's where legislation decisions happen, war, foreign powers decisions, and all of that, he thinks, you can see can be centralized without destroying liberty. But administrative power is that day-to-day regulation of local life, like rebuilding roads, maintaining them, schools, welfare. And in his view, if this doesn't remain local, when it's centralized, citizens become managed rather than self-governing. France is the cautionary example of this, and both kinds of power have been pulled to the center, with the result that a population dependent on a distant administrative apparatus has atrophied the habits of civic agency. And so it's been really interesting to see students over time and watch them compare America of the past, France of the past, and then look at America today and see, does this look more like America of the past, or does it look more like France of the past, actually? So before I go on anymore, Rob, what do you have to say? How did you first encounter Tocqueville?
Well, first let me say I'm very happy to be here, and it's a lovely opportunity to speak about Tocqueville with you, my lovely wife. So we're both Canadian, and that reduces the sort of chance to encounter American political thought in our education. And for example, someone like Tocqueville. My first encounter with Democracy in America was as a teacher assistant for Professor Dana Villa at Notre Dame. And it was a wonderful opportunity, but I felt a little bit bashful teaching Tocqueville as a Canadian to Americans about America. So I really had to, make sure I knew what I was talking about, and I poured myself into the text. My experience of Tocqueville really focused initially on how he wrote and thought, not just what he was saying, the way he thinks and how he expresses. And I think this is really important for not only scholarship, but also for education. And Tocqueville is, I think, extremely helpful and instructive to teach us how to think about politics and life in general. So teaching Tocqueville and teaching political theory in general, I noticed several habits of thought that we often encounter in contemporary life that Tocqueville noticed, but also gives us alternatives to practice for ourselves. So one of the concerns Tocqueville had was that in a democracy, democratic citizens tend to think in a very general mode. That is to say that they think about political life, even human life, in sort of vast abstractions and generalities that don't connect to the particulars of everyday life and the root of human experience. In addition to that, democratic citizens, he says, tends to personify these abstractions, giving them sort of will and intent and agency. For example, we might have a vast general idea or abstraction such as history or society, and then we can tend to personify those ideas. So for instance, we might say, history says, or history marches forward. And in thinking of those terms, we lose all the particularities that are actually operative behind the political phenomenon. Also, I think Tocqueville, in his compressed style, where he writes in a kind of enthymemic mode, helps to teach us to work through the particularities of those general ideas. Your point about the administrative state and centralization connects to this very well. In thinking of these vast generalities, the mind is sort of naturally turned to think about politics at the national level, forgetting the local level of politics that you were pointing out. When we think politics, we think national politics, big issues that may be far away from us. And then we conceive of what politics actually is in its essence is something very powerful and centralized and very far away from us. Tocqueville warns that over time we think that that thing, that far off, vast, centralized, mighty power is also our salvation. In addition to what I feel like Tocqueville helps us understand is to slow down and think patiently about politics and human life by the way he writes. So, for instance, when he looks at certain political phenomenon, he notes when it might seem contradictory. And if we're too hasty in thinking and we encounter something like a contradiction, we might throw the whole thing out. When in reality, when you look at the same thing from different perspectives, there is an inner tension that demands investigation and not dismissal. For instance, on the one hand, Tocqueville points out that Americans and democratic citizens tend to have a kind of pride and independent judgment. People think, I know the truth, or it's all subjective, or it's unique to me. You can't tell me what to do. You can tell me how to think. But on the other hand, Tocqueville points out that many citizens become reliant on mass popular opinion. So both things are true, even though formally it would look like a contradiction. Similarly, he points out that we tend to want to think in these abstractions, but when it comes to certain details and practicalities in politics, democratic citizens can slow down and not fall into the trap of abstract political theories that are politically dangerous. It looks like there's a tension there, but he teaches the reader to think about some underlying principle that puts these two tense observations together. One of my prevailing experiences of reading Tocqueville is how to read more deeply and how to form the way of thinking to think about politics in a more complex and I think a more real way, rather than relying on sort of these abstractions or general ideas which mask how complex the world is. You find a tendency to reduce political debates, the study of politics, religion, and a wealth of other things into sort of snappy memes that are empty of content, and then divide up the world into these generalities and pit them against each other, which I think has deepened sort of polarization. And Tocqueville, not just what he says, but how he writes and how he thinks, teaches us to escape that by looking at how he treats things like contradiction, or his enthymemic form of reasoning, which is to compress one's arguments and not state everything explicitly. But it's up to the reader to draw out those principles and ideas and see the argument in its wholeness. I think that's instrumental for education, especially in the liberal arts, that we could develop the skills and dispositions to do that.
That's really interesting because we're used to hearing a lot about Tocqueville in terms of the concepts that everyone talks about, that he talks about, like the democratic social state I mentioned earlier, equality of conditions, associations, Self-Interest Rightly Understood, Soft Despotism, but you're really looking at Tocqueville in terms of how he cast his eye upon America when he, went those 7,000 miles, talked with his friend Gustave every night, and then synthesized that into the 2-volume work that he published over the next decade. How did you come to focus on this more methodological approach that you see in Tocqueville?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot more to be said about Tocqueville's casting his eye over America and France that requires a lot of detailed analysis and engagement in the debates in the Tocqueville scholarship. But my beginning interest in how political thinkers write really developed reading the works of Abu Nasr Al-Farabi, who was the first Muslim political philosopher in the Middle Ages. And he writes in a very compressed style, almost like summaries. If you read him carefully, he leaves many premises absent or hidden. And you need to extract them yourself to complete the argument. And I saw this as a form of pedagogy, that the reader is given just enough to think for themselves, to draw forth the argument. And Montesquieu hints at this himself when he said he wrote a book for people to, not just read, but to inspire thinking, to think about. Montesquieu as well has a very compressed style, and so does Nietzsche. And I think one of the needs of liberal education today is to, continually teach and learn how to read. Put aside maybe our impatience or our desire for quick, constantly changing, pleasurable content, and look at a text and ask yourself, what is the author really saying? And how to build out from the text the complete picture that the author is drawing for you. If you take that approach and look at the text across the history of philosophy, just the way these thinkers think and speak, I think teach the mind and shape our dispositions to have a broader, deeper, liberal education. We'll just think, you study Plato. How does Socrates argue and speak with his interlocutors?
Yeah, well, that's the thing is it's often compressed. You don't get the whole story. You get little pieces. You get little tidbits of details that Plato inserts of the dramatic details. You get a variety of approaches. So who he's talking to, what he says will change according to who he's talking to. And then you get that same thing where you have an apparent contradiction and you have to work through, is this really a contradiction? And it's pedagogical. It's completely pedagogical because it takes so much effort from the reader to even begin to make sense of what the author is really saying here.
Yeah, we always have to be careful not to impose our own opinions on the text. But I think that compressed style or adding those details that are not strictly straightforward respects the rational autonomy of the reader to work through it themselves. And so it's not like they're trying to indoctrinate you. No, I think these authors, many of them, are trying to liberate you, to think for yourself. It's interesting, you talking about Plato and the way Plato writes. I've been working on a paper on the relationship between the Wisdom of Solomon and Plato's Republic. One question that I think is often forgotten is that when you're reading books from the Bible, each book has a different genre. So you have like wisdom literature, you have novellas, you have exposition of the laws, you have narrative. Rather than say, just for example, reading the Bible where it's verse, and sentences taken out of context and then fighting each other over different interpretations. Merely asking the question, what is the genre of this particular book of the Bible? What is it? And what will that mean for the argument and the unfolding of the text? And even that question changes your approach to it. Your dispositions and attitude with respect to reading it will change, and I think it'll be very illuminating if you take that into account, just like you're pointing out that Plato wrote dramatic dialogues, not treatises.
And speaking of Tocqueville, to bring it back to him and how he was potentially being pedagogical, especially for democratic citizens. If people living in a democracy have this tendency towards general ideas, then what do you need to do? You need to give them general ideas. They're going to like that. It's going to make the work intelligible to them. But what are you going to do? You're going to bring it back to the details. And what do you get? You get 2 volumes of dense detail. that Tocqueville has given us. So it sounds like that's his way of kind of educating particularly Democrats for how to avoid the dangers of falling into, like, general ideas turned into personified abstractions that are kind of meaningless or memeified.
Well, I want to think one of the great intellectual enterprises for the human being is to move from particular experience to greater and greater generalizations, and then reason from those generalizations back to the particular experiences and see what that does in the progress of knowledge. So there's an up and down approach going from here to what is beyond and back, which you see, of course, in Al-Farabi and, Plato's Republic as a form of dialectic. That takes a lot of patience, and then part of liberal education is to teach that patience, but we need to teach that patience through making it exciting, particularly today. There's a journey of the mind from this, world of immediate experience to the ideas and concepts that are in part moving the world around us, and then back again. I mean, it really has an ABA structure, like a sonata. You start at home, you go on your journey, and then you return home, but you return home changed.
Well, I think that's the perfect place to end this in terms of the podcast. Luckily, we'll be able to keep talking about this as we go home and are at home. Of course, we'll have the interruption of about 7,000 children's question, not 7,000 children, but 3 children's, approximately 7,000 questions on a daily basis. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Rob Larrivee.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Tocqueville Talks. This episode was produced by Audrey Enghauser. Lucy Southwell provided administrative support. The theme music is called The Girl I Left Behind Me, a popular folk song in early 19th century America, here performed by Jacob Taylor Armerding. To learn more about our lecture series and events, our Tocqueville and Beaumont Fellows programs for undergraduates, and to listen to episodes, watch event recordings, or support our work, search on Google for the Tocqueville Center at Furman University. If you enjoyed the episode, please like, subscribe, comment, and share Tocqueville Talks on all your favorite listening services. And visit our YouTube channel for full recordings of past events and episodes. Until next time, goodbye.